Hi, I'm Dennis Rasmussen. I'm a political theory professor and the Haggerty Family Fellow at Syracuse's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. So most of the talk today is going to be about Douglass. Before I turn to Douglass, I want to say a few words about the founding more generally, or about how we tend to approach the founding today. We Americans have, of course, wrestled with the role that slavery played in the nation's birth since the founding era itself. Today, I think it's fair to say that most people tend to approach this issue from one of two broad camps. So one camp holds that the founders were, maybe if not the demigods of lore, at least reasonably wise and well-intentioned individuals who somehow managed against very long odds to establish a successful constitutional republic. On this view, the Declaration of Independence was a revolutionary statement of universal ideals of liberty and equality, individual rights, and the Constitution was an innovative blueprint for political liberty, and we should continue to cherish both of them. The presence of slavery during the founding era, this first camp holds, was a large and of course lamentable, but temporary aberration, and moreover one that the founding generation did its best to combat. The Civil War and Reconstruction and the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century not only removed this stain from America's social and political fabric, but did so by appealing to the very principles that the founders had articulated. So that's the first camp. But there's a second camp that holds that chattel slavery made a mockery of the founders' principles. So the Declaration says all men are created equal, they possess inalienable rights, but the sincerity of these claims is belied by the presence of around 600,000 enslaved people spread across every one of the newly independent states. The Constitution included various protections and even benefits for slaveholding interests, which enabled slavery to expand over the course of the next 7 decades, during which time slaveholders dominated much of the federal government. America became the greatest slave power in the world. The second camp also notes, of course, that many of the leading founders, including George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, each enslaved hundreds of human beings, which revealed their high-sounding principles to be just so much hypocritical cant. So the second camp holds that America's founding ideals were just a flimsy cover for the perpetuation of slavery and white supremacy. And this latter view, more critical view of the founding, I think is in many ways neatly encapsulated in the 1619 Project that was launched by the New York Times in 2019 to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the arrival of enslaved Africans on American soil. And then the first view, the more admiring view of the founding, was in turn neatly encapsulated by what was called the 1776 Report. This was commissioned by President Trump during his first term in office as an explicitly patriotic response to the 1619 Project. And so both received their fair share of criticism, that many prominent scholars criticized the 1619 Project. I think most dismissed the 1776 report out of hand. But I still think it's fair to say that these capture the two main views of the founding in today's culture wars. So I'm just going to call them the 1619 view and the 1776 view for short. So adherents of the 1619 view of the founding and founders tend to regard those who adopt the 1776 view as just willfully blind to the oppression that's blighted so much of American history, and often overly complacent about the racial ills that continue to pervade America today. Whereas partisans of the 1776 view, for their part, tend to regard those who side with the 1619 view as downright un-American and also overly eager to cancel historical individuals from the distant past who somehow didn't act as if they just emerged from a modern DEI training, diversity, equity, inclusion training. Now, as I understand it, the dispute between these two positions stems not just from a clash of values. So you might say, okay, should we prioritize patriotism or the combating of oppression? Which one is more important? But I think it also stems from a disagreement about the empirical question, historical question. What was the role that slavery played in the founding? What were the founders' attitudes toward this institution really? You see this debate playing out in contemporary scholarship. Some historians and political theorists stress the anti-slavery side of the founding. Others stress the more pro-slavery side. And what I want to suggest is that it's worth our while to turn to Frederick Douglass as a way to reflect on this vexed question of, what our attitude toward the founding and founders should be, given their complicity regarding slavery. And my book tries to show that Douglass's speeches and writings contain some of the most probing examinations of this question ever. And they're all the more fascinating because he dramatically changed his mind about the founding over the course of his career, about midway through his career. Now, Douglass was also, of course, pretty much perfectly situated to reflect on this subject. He experienced slavery himself, right? He grew up enslaved on Maryland's eastern shore until he escaped to the North at around age 20. He also went on to become America's foremost abolitionist and arguably its greatest champion of freedom more generally. So he spent a half century as an author and orator. During that time, he was often cast as the spokesman, even the embodiment of the slave's position. Sometimes he even appropriated that position for himself, most famously in his most famous speech, I think his greatest speech, called What to the Slave is the 4th of July. Today, Douglass is admired almost universally in America in a way that few other historical figures are. Even Abraham Lincoln now has his detractors thanks to his alleged racism. But Douglass has somehow managed to remain a hero in an age that delights in tearing heroes down. So I think it's predictable as little wonder that he's venerated on the political left, given the many progressive causes that he devoted his life to championing, not just the end of slavery and racial equality, but also women's rights, the end of capital punishment, universal public education, and on and on. So Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's the principal author of the 1619 Project, has declared that Douglass was perhaps the greatest American this country has ever produced. But Douglass is also equally, I think, admired on the political right, in part because of his lifelong advocacy of hard work and individual responsibility. So Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas is fond of quoting Douglass in his opinions, for instance. When a statue of Douglass was unveiled in the U.S. Capitol building in 2013, leading congressional Republicans sported buttons that said, rather anachronistically, sported buttons that said Frederick Douglass was a Republican. Even President Trump declared, to the bewilderment of some and the amusement of others, that Douglass is an example of someone who's done an amazing job that's being more and more recognized, I notice. But Douglass, I would argue, is more than a mere symbol to be appropriated for present-day purposes. I think he was more even than a courageous individual whose inspiring life story can be trotted out every February for Black History Month. He was also, I would submit, he's one of the intellectual luminaries of his age. If there was anything that Douglass loved as much as freedom, it was learning. He recalled in all 3 of his autobiographies that surreptitiously learning to read as a young boy, which was against the law for enslaved people, not only gave him a kind of inner liberation while he remained in bondage, but also paved the way toward actual physical freedom. So he never spent a single day in school, but he sought to make up for his lack of formal education through a life of voracious reading and writing and speaking. And I think others may have surpassed him in maybe the depth or the originality of his ideas. He's a reformer. He's not a scholar. He's not a philosopher. But he was a sensitive reader. He was a careful thinker, and he was a marvelously effective communicator. As a big part of his life of reading and writing and speaking, he studied the American founders, and that's really what my book centers on. So what I want to do is I'm going to start by talking for a few minutes about his early view, his very critical view of the founding and founders. I'll spend just a minute talking about his change of mind, and then I want to say somewhat more about his mature or later view of the founding and founders. Okay, so when Douglass first joined the abolition movement, this is just a couple of years after his escape from slavery, he was then a devoted follower of William Lloyd Garrison. So Garrison was the leading abolitionist in America throughout the 1830s and 40s. He was the editor of The Liberator, which is the leading anti-slavery newspaper. He was the chief organizer of the American Anti-Slavery Society, which is the nation's biggest abolitionist organization. And Garrison was he's a fascinating figure, held a number of fascinating views. But for our purposes, I think the most important aspect of his outlook was that he was deeply critical of the founders, deeply critical of the Constitution. He thought that the founders were just hypocrites for fighting for their own liberty while they kept others in chains. He regarded the Constitution as a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, as he called it again and again. So why? Well, as Garrison read it, and most Americans read it, the Constitution included a number of protections and even rewards for slaveholding interests. It included a guarantee that fugitives would be returned to those who held them in bondage. It included an augmentation of slaveholders' voting power in both the House of Representatives and the Electoral College, amounting to 3/5 of the population that they'd enslaved. And it included an assurance that the international slave trade would continue, at least for a time. And Garrison thought that these kinds of provisions made the Constitution not just flawed, but downright evil. So at a 4th of July celebration in 1854, he publicly burned a copy of the Constitution and ground its ashes under his heels. That's what he thought of the Constitution. And Douglass, early on, essentially followed Garrison's lead on all of these points throughout the 1840s. So again, he escapes from slavery in 1838. Pretty soon he comes across The Liberator. He starts reading it. He says it became his meat and drink. He loves Garrison. He loves The Liberator. He met Garrison in person at an abolitionist meeting on the island of Nantucket in 1841. And the American Anti-Slavery Society pretty quickly hired him as a traveling lecturer. And this was a meteoric rise. Douglass was at this time, he's a 23-year-old manual laborer, just 3 years removed from slavery. But he's such an electrifying orator that in almost no time at all, he becomes not just nationally famous, but internationally famous. He's one of the most celebrated, most sought-after orators of the age, in an age when attending these kinds of public lectures was enormously popular. It was on the par with pop music or sports today. It's something everybody did. Douglass was also, interestingly enough, the most photographed American of the 19th century. So again, throughout the 1840s, Douglass puts this newfound celebrity in the service of promulgating Garrison's views of the Constitution and the founders and pretty much everything else. He later claimed that he adopted these views, Garrison's views, almost unthinkingly. That, frankly, doesn't seem quite right to me. I think he had very good reasons for adopting all of the positions he did. I'm not going to rehearse all the arguments there. There's a lot. I spent 2 full chapters of the book on this, but I do want to give just a taste of what he said about the founding early in his career. I'll read a few choice quotations from this period. So Douglass challenged one audience. Talk to me of the love of liberty of your Washingtons or Jeffersons or Henrys. He who does not love justice and liberty for all does not love liberty and justice. They wrote of liberty in the Declaration of Independence with one hand, and with the other they clutched their brother by the throat. These are the men who formed the Union. In another speech, he described the founders as little better than a band of pirates. As for the Constitution, at one point Douglass described it as, quote, nothing more than a compromise with man-stealers and a cunningly devised complication of falsehoods that pledges the whole civil, naval, and military power of the nation to keep 3 million people in the most abject slavery. At another point, he described the Constitution, as, quote, a most cunningly devised and wicked compact, demanding the most constant and earnest efforts of the friends of righteous freedom for its complete overthrow. So again, for nearly a decade, this was Douglass's view. The founders were wicked oppressors. The Constitution was emphatically pro-slavery. So there's no question that he fully appreciated the power of what we might think of as the first incarnation of the 1619 view of the founding and founders. He articulated this view as compellingly as anyone did. But then beginning in 1849, over the course of more than 2 years, a long process, more than 2 years of study and reflection, he dramatically changed his mind. So he describes this he wrote 3 autobiographies. The second, and I think best version of his autobiography is called My Bondage and My Freedom. He describes there how he undertook a painstaking course of thought and reading that led him to rethink the whole subject of the founding, as he put it. So I think this is fascinating. His speeches, his writings during this 2-year window are fascinating. It allows us to see this guy, an intellect of the first rank, wrestling with this big, important question and concluding that he'd been wrong, that for the past decade he had been in the wrong. And so, again, it's a long process. During these 2 years, his thinking takes a number of different steps, each one moving him toward a more positive view of the nation's birth. I could spend my entire talk about going through each step and what motivated it, but I think it'll be more useful to concentrate instead on, again, his more mature view of the founding and founders, the view that he held from basically 1851 onward. He regarded the nation's fathers, as he liked to call them, as overwhelmingly hostile to slavery, and he regarded the Constitution as a downright abolitionist charter, even before the addition of the Reconstruction Amendments. So let me take each of those in turn. So first, the founders themselves. So after he changed his opinion, Douglass came to think that when he had disparaged the founders' commitment to liberty back in the 1840s, he'd been essentially projecting backward from his own time, when pro-slavery views were far more common and pro-slavery interests were far more powerful. So that once he'd studied the founding more closely, he found a bunch of signs that he thought pointing to the fact that the overall overarching sentiment during the founding era, the kind of moral political sentiment of the country was in fact anti-slavery. So one such indication, he thought, was simply that slavery was restricted and discouraged by law without a struggle in the 1780s in a way that would have been just unthinkable in the 1850s. So in the 1850s, for people who know the history of the era, in the 1850s, slaveholding powers are continually seeking ever greater territory, ever more protections. You think the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, the Dred Scott decision of 1857. But slavery is really on the march. Whereas in the 18th century, slavery was decidedly on the defensive. It was imploring to be spared only for a brief season, as Douglass put it. So what's the evidence? He says, well, let's look at the two main founding documents. We start with the Declaration of Independence. So Chief Justice Roger Taney claimed in his infamous Dred Scott decision that the declaration of the self-evident truths of the Declaration of Independence were never meant to be applied to black people. So the idea is that all men only mean some men, and those white men, as Douglass kind of sarcastically put it. Whereas Taney thought the Declaration wasn't meant to be applied to black people, Douglass insisted that they meant to, that they used deliberately universal language so as to put a full and comprehensive declaration of the equal and sacred rights of mankind before the broad eye of the whole world. Those are Douglass's words. Similarly, he said the framers of the Constitution were attached to liberty. How do we know? They announced in the preamble their desire to attain its blessings to themselves and their posterity, right? At the time of the new government's birth, he said, slavery was such a low, despised, and hated thing, and slaveholding interests were so weak and humble-mouthed that the framers wouldn't even stoop to name slavery within the Constitution's text. So, as many people likely know, the words slave and slavery never appear in the Constitution, even in the clauses that were thought to refer to slavery, and I'm going to come back to those toward the end of my talk. Even in those passages, the framers resorted to circumlocutions, like all other persons, such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, person held to service or labor. These circumlocutions to try to avoid any explicit reference to slavery. And why? So Douglass's explanation for this roundabout language was that, quote, at that time, overwhelmingly, the people were in favor of gradual emancipation, and they wished when the giant inequity should fall that there might be no token of it left to disgrace their documentary history. So he thought the kind of general sentiment of the founding era was decidedly hostile to slavery. He thought that the leading figures among the founders were even more hostile to slavery. In 1858, he told another audience, the fact is there is scarcely a single great man of revolutionary memory who is so ignorant and so base and so lost to the sentiment of shame as to defend the principle of slavery. On the contrary, and he continued, I'm going to keep reading, this is Douglass again, the chief and recognized builders of the Republic, almost without an exception, openly condemned that principle. Washington, Franklin, Jefferson, Adams, Madison, Monroe, Patrick Henry, Roger Sherman, George Mason, Luther Martin, and other distinguished men of the earlier and better days of the Republic condemned the system of slavery as a great moral and political evil. So it's worth noting that the majority of these quote-unquote distinguished men, whom he describes as being anti-slavery, were themselves Southerners and slaveholders. And so this is, some of Douglass's contemporaries, and this would include Taney and Garrison, pro-slavery and anti-slavery, many assumed that those founders who were themselves slaveholders must have been in favor of slavery. Douglass pointed out that there's little to sustain such an assumption, that whatever we might think about their inability to reconcile their personal practice with their principles, every one of these figures declared numerous times in published writings, in speeches, in private letters, just all over the place, that slavery was deeply and obviously wrong, that they hoped to see it die out. Okay, but if the founders were so deeply opposed to slavery, we might very well ask, then why didn't they abolish it? Douglass's answer was that they did abolish it in more than half the country, and they did what they could to put it on the road to abolition in the South. So just as a reminder for those who don't know the history, all 7 of the northern states, north of Maryland and Delaware, plus the state to be of Vermont, either abolished slavery outright or at least set up a gradual emancipation scheme by the end of the founding era. Slavery was also abolished outright in the massive Northwest Territory, all the way out to the present-day Minnesota by the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And half of the remaining slave states, namely Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, all liberalized their manumission laws, meaning they made it easier for individual slaveholders to free their slaves, which they did in surprisingly large numbers. In fact, given that there were so many vastly more enslaved people in the South than the North, it's possible that more were freed in the South through individual manumission than in the North through statewide abolition. So Douglass, he kind of dons his best rose-tinted glasses. He sums up the situation like this. Slavery was barely tolerated as an evil already smitten with decay by the principles of the Revolution. The doctrines of gradual emancipation were being preached, hearts were being melted, and hands directed by those doctrines were loosing the bonds of wickedness and letting the oppressed go free. Still further, most of the founders hoped and expected that slavery would die out in the relatively near future, thanks to the practical measures that they took against it, thanks to what they took to be its economic inefficiency, and just thanks to the liberal forces, egalitarian forces that the revolution had unleashed. So Douglass wrote, "The statesmen of that early period held slavery to be an expiring institution. I doubt if there were more than a dozen men in the convention that framed the Constitution who did not expect that slavery in this country would cease forever long before the year 1851. That's the year that he was saying this. So, and this is true, right? The founders did expect that slavery's demise was inevitable and at least reasonably imminent. I think this helps to explain why so many of the founders who were very firmly anti-slavery didn't push all that hard for abolition in the South. They told themselves, okay, well, pushing hard for abolition in the South, this would imperil our still new, still fragile Union, but also there's just no need to devote too much energy to combating an institution that's just doomed by history anyway, right? Of course, they're wrong about this. Slavery doesn't die out. On the contrary, it expands both demographically within the South and also geographically to the West, especially after the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 helps to multiply its profitability. But still, the point here is, in terms of judging the founders' intentions, it was important to Douglass that they thought of slavery not as a permanent and unavoidable evil, but rather as a temporary one, whose demise they were helping to hasten. So all in all, this is how Douglass saw the relationship between the founding and slavery. He thought the general sentiment of the country during the founding era was decidedly anti-slavery. The leading figures of the period, including the slaveholders among them, were still more resolutely anti-slavery. The founders successfully abolished slavery in the South. They did what they could to put it on the road to abolition in the North, and they took heart in this idea that it's soon going to die out altogether. Okay, so let me turn next to Douglass's mature view of the Constitution. So again, in the 1840s, he had, like William Lloyd Garrison, like his mentor, he had viewed the Constitution as a wicked, pro-slavery covenant with death. By the 1850s, he came to regard it as a glorious liberty document. That's how he described it in What to the Slave is the 4th of July. Now, I should note that by this point, there were lots of folks who had argued that the Constitution was broadly anti-slavery or could be used for anti-slavery purposes. The most common and I think influential variant of this view marched under the banner Freedom National. So I'd say Salmon P. Chase was probably the foremost architect of this Freedom National viewpoint. It was also embraced by people like William Seward, Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, eventually Abraham Lincoln himself, right? So the most resolutely anti-slavery folks on the national stage adopted this view. And the basic view here was that freedom was the goal and the default position, if you want to put it that way, of the federal government. So slavery is just a local institution. It's protected only within the confines of the states that explicitly sanctioned it, along with their fugitives. So the upshot that, according to this reading of the Constitution, the federal government can and should simply ban slavery from the Western territories and from any states that might be created out of the Western territories. It should ban slavery from Washington, D.C., which was under Congress's control, from federal forts and arsenals, from ships on the high seas. They also argued that, northern states are obliged to allow Southerners to recapture their runaways, but that federal officials shouldn't and maybe couldn't aid in this process. And so the hope was, for these Freedom National folks, the hope is, if we surround the South with a cordon of freedom, if liberty is the national rule and slavery is the local exception, then eventually slavery would wither and die even in the South. That's the hope. But the flip side of this kind of localization of slavery was, even they argued, that the supporters of Freedom National argued, that the federal government had no power to interfere with slavery within the southern states themselves, much less abolish it within the South itself. So, the federal authority could not reach into the states, even according to Chase, Seward, Stevens, Sumner, and Lincoln. Douglass says it can. Douglass is one of the very, very few thinkers who went further than this and argued that the Constitution wasn't just anti-slavery. It was a downright abolitionist document, that if you faithfully execute it, you have to instantly free every enslaved person in the country, including in the South. Now, he's not the first person to read the Constitution that way. He was himself quick to stress his reading of the Constitution drew on the work of others, above all people who are very little known today, William Goodell, Lysander Spooner, and Garrett Smith. They're very colorful characters. They're very interesting, and much more important in their time than their almost total lack of name recognition today would suggest. I devote a whole chapter of my book to them. I'm trying to help kind of rescue them from undeserved obscurity. But for the purposes of this talk, I'll just stick with Douglass. So, because even if he's not the first to adopt this abolitionist reading of the Constitution, he is the most prominent person to adopt this view. He devoted hundreds of speeches and newspaper articles to it, which I think is a sign of the importance that he attached to it. So before I turn to what Douglass says about the Constitution and slavery, let me say a few words about Douglass's approach toward constitutional interpretation more generally. It's hard to pinpoint with really a great deal of specificity what his method of constitutional interpretation is, in part because he's frankly not always entirely consistent about what method to use. But he did think that there were some clearly wrong ways to read the Constitution. So one of those wrong ways, in his view, was just accepting the pronouncements of the Supreme Court as beyond challenge. Just whatever the Supreme Court says, that's what the Constitution says. He wrote that those who maintain that the Constitution is and must necessarily be just what the Supreme Court declares it to be, in effect, do away with the Constitution altogether and substitute, therefore, the mere opinions of a few men. And more generally, he resisted the idea that the Constitution should be the exclusive preserve of courts and judges and lawyers. He pointed out that the American Constitution, unlike, say, Britain's rather complicated unwritten Constitution, the U.S. Constitution is a reasonably compact, plainly written document that anyone can read for themselves and interpret on their own. And so he says, you have to at least begin with what he calls a plain and common sense reading of the instrument itself, just the words on the page. He also opposed the idea of allowing one's reading to be shaped by how the government had acted, what laws it had passed under the Constitution since its adoption. So this today might be called history and tradition, very prominent especially on the political right. The justices tend to lean toward the political right today. And it's also something that in his time, the Garrisonians constantly emphasized, that they thought that the unbroken practice of the government for the last 7 decades, well, this is sufficient proof, right, that the Constitution sanctioned slavery. Here too, Douglass says no. He insists that, quote, the Constitution is one thing and its administration is another, and in this instance, a very different and opposite thing. So he thinks the policies adopted by the government shouldn't be conflated with the charter that created that government. The fact that the government or its officials condone slavery doesn't mean that the Constitution itself condones slavery. If that were true, if the practice of the government under the Constitution were sufficient to reveal its meaning, then he said, well, why do we have the charter in the first place, right? So he didn't think we should automatically defer to history or tradition, historical precedent, any more than we should automatically defer to the courts. But the approach that he rejected most emphatically was trying to ground the meaning of the Constitution in the founders' intentions, whether it be the intentions of the framers of the Constitution at the Philadelphia Convention or the ratifiers in the various state conventions. He thought their intentions don't matter at all, except insofar as they were written into the text of the Constitution itself. Now, as I said, Douglass did think that most of the founders were anti-slavery, but he never thought that their intentions were decisive, again, separate from the document that they crafted. So why? The idea that the Constitution's meaning depended on the subjective states of mind of individuals who framed it or who adopted it, he thought is, quote, destructive of all written constitutions, covenants, and agreements. If we are to be governed by supposed apprehensions and not by the words of the bond, then the bond is of no use whatsoever. He also pointed out that the framers themselves seemed to want the Constitution to speak for itself, the words on the page to speak for themselves, as evidenced by the fact that they conducted their deliberations behind closed doors, behind a veil of secrecy. They refused to allow their proceedings to be published until they were all dead, right? But the broader point is, it's the words on the page that the American people adopted, not, he says, what the framers were ashamed to say or afraid to say, including about slavery. So again, the main point is he thinks the Constitution's meaning should be derived so far as possible from the text itself. Okay, let me finally turn to that text. The single most prominent part of the Constitution, of course, is its opening preamble. And Douglass thought that this showed that the entire purpose of the Constitution was emphatically anti-slavery. So the preamble states very famously that the Constitution was ordained and established in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. It might seem to be almost go without saying today, but he sought to demonstrate to his readers, to his listeners, that slavery ran afoul of all 6 of these objectives that are outlined in the preamble. So first, a more perfect union. Well, he says the union is made less perfect, meaning the states are less united, thanks to the divide between the free North and the slaveholding South, right? He says there's no such thing as a perfect union while we have both liberty and slavery. There's opposite as light and darkness, as heaven and hell, and there can never be a real union formed between the two. Okay, the second objective, establishing justice. Well, he says, obviously, there could be no slavery if justice were established. By its very nature, slavery is injustice in its most malignant form. The nation also, he said, enjoyed less domestic tranquility, thanks to the conflicts over slavery that are continually agitating its politics. It's more difficult to defend because of the constant threat of slave uprisings and the resources that are required to suppress them. The fifth objective, he asks, if the general welfare was cared for, would 4 million be doomed to slavery? Would 2 million women be left to the unbridled lust of 350,000 slaveholders? And then the final aim, listed in the preamble, is in some ways the easiest case of all. The blessings of liberty are quite obviously incompatible with what Douglass called the various despotism that the sunlight ever flashed upon. So the aims, the purposes of the Constitution are clearly anti-slavery in his view. So too are many of its provisions, which are manifestly designed to promote liberty and justice and the like. Now, it's important to note here, and Douglass did note this time and again, that in addition to never using the word slave or slavery, the Constitution also never uses words like white or black, or any euphemism for racial differences. And in particular, it never so much as hints that its provisions apply to white people alone. As Douglass put it, the Constitution knows no man by the color of his skin. The men who made it were too noble for any such limitation of humanity and human rights. The word white is a modern term in the legislation of this country. It was never used in the better days of the Republic, but has sprung up within the period of our national degeneracy. In his view, the main piece of evidence that the Constitution did apply to Black people could hardly have been more obvious. It came in the first three words, right? The first three words of the Constitution, the preamble, is "we the people." As he says, not we the white people, not we the citizens, not we the privileged class, not we of English or Scotch or French extraction, but we the people, and if we the people are included, Negroes are included. That's the end of the quote from Douglass. And so his point is, look, if Black people are included in these provisions in the Constitution, well, there's a whole slew of provisions that, if faithfully executed, would instantly free every enslaved person in the land, right? So he points to a bunch of them in this regard: the prohibitions on habeas corpus and bills of attainder, the Privileges and Immunities Clause, what's known as the Guarantee Clause, that guarantees every state a republican form of government. But for simplicity's sake, let me just zero in on one of them, namely the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment. So the Fifth Amendment stipulates that, quote, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." Okay, that's very sweeping language, right? As Douglass points out, this would seem to apply to everyone on American soil, not just citizens. It doesn't say no citizen shall be can be deprived of these things without due process. It says no person can be deprived without due process. And again, enslaved people are referred to as persons, people, even in the clauses that were thought to sanction slavery. So there's no question, are they people? And of course, the Due Process Clause would seem to forbid slavery as it's practiced throughout the South, right? Without due process of law. Douglass says, what do we mean by due process? We mean indictment, trial by jury, in open court for some offense against the law. Of course, the millions of enslaved people in the South had gotten no such thing, no such due process, right? And so his simple conclusion was that, quote, "Our brethren in bonds are now and ever have been deprived of their liberty without due process of law, contrary to the positive declaration of the Constitution that no person should be so deprived." So again, Douglass thinks that the Constitution could be and should be read as an abolitionist charter, given both the stated aims of the preamble and the multitude of provisions like these, all of which just fly in the face of the entire institution of slavery. But of course, there were some other provisions, some other clauses that were widely, almost universally seen as sanctioning slavery. Douglass is, of course, well aware of them. He had, during his Garrisonian years in the 1840s, he had highlighted them repeatedly as evidence of the Constitution's pro-slavery character. But now he says no. After 1851, he says not one word in these clauses can be seen as justifying or sanctioning slavery by any just understanding of the English language. So I'll go through, I should admit up front, this is probably the part of Douglass's argument that's going to be least persuasive to most audiences today, whether you buy it or not. His reading of these clauses, his reasoning is, I think, fascinating. But the basic point, Douglass found ways to kind of construe or whittle away the pro-slavery, allegedly pro-slavery clauses in such a way that by the time he was finished with them, they weren't even about slavery at all. So I'll just quickly run through the three main clauses that were seen as sanctioning slavery. So the first is the infamous 3/5 clause. It's Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution apportioned representatives and direct taxes according to each state's population, which was to be determined by adding, quote, "to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, 3/5 of all other persons." So if you read the records from the Philadelphia Convention, James Madison's notes, it's abundantly clear that by all other persons here, they meant enslaved people, right? But Douglass said no. Douglass said the text of the Constitution, the words on the page, suggested otherwise, right? So whatever the framers may have meant or intended, he said, what is the phrase "all other persons" in this clause? It should be understood to mean resident aliens, meaning immigrants who haven't yet been naturalized, not slaves. Why? Well, okay, so the clause distinguishes these other persons from free persons. But of course, Douglass notes free can mean many different things. Free can mean not enslaved, but it could also mean something more like the enjoyment of full political privileges, or the privileges of citizenship. And he went on a long historical tour to try to show that this latter usage was the dominant usage in the years leading up to the adoption of the Constitution. Right? That we have the common phrase "free British subjects." It means British citizens, right? He notes that that's the way the term was used in the Articles of Confederation, the first stab at a national constitution. And so he thought, there's every reason to think it's used the same way in the Constitution itself. And so he posits that the other persons, the unfree persons in this clause, were best understood as just those who don't enjoy full political privileges, specifically unnaturalized immigrants or resident aliens. So that's how he manages to just construe the 3/5 clause as entirely unrelated to slavery. He did something similar with respect to the slave trade clause, or what he called the importation clause. So this is Article 1, Section 9, which provided that, quote, the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808. Now, again, the records from the Philadelphia Convention leave no doubt that the persons that the framers had in mind here were kidnapped Africans. But Douglass argued that here the phrase such persons should be read as to refer to foreigners coming into the country more generally. Not just enslaved people, right? So in his reading, this provision just said Congress can't prevent the states from welcoming immigrants as they see fit until 1808. And he also pointed out, moreover, even if this clause did apply to slavery, it was aimed at limiting slavery, right? So it was widely assumed during the founding era that the end of the international slave trade would mean the end of slavery itself. Douglass says, the slave trade was regarded as the jugular vein of slavery. Their theory was cut off the stream and the pond would dry up. And so he, early in his career as a Garrisonian, he had looked at this clause as a 20-year protection for the slave trade. Now, in his mature view, he sees it as a new grant of power to Congress to ban this trade after a short time and hopefully bring about the end of slavery altogether. If this is about slavery at all, which he said, it's not necessarily. Okay, one more to go. This is the Fugitive Slave Clause, or Douglass calls it the Fugitives from Service Clause. Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution stipulated that, quote, no person held to service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. Okay. On this one, the records from 1787 are much more sparse. It's not totally clear that the founders were thinking exclusively of slaves. I think slaves were definitely one of the categories. People running away to a free state is one of the categories they had in mind. But again, Douglass says it doesn't matter what the framers meant or what they intended, that if you read the words on the page, it doesn't say anything about enslaved people, that it makes more sense as applied to other groups, namely indentured servants and apprentices. Why? Okay, the clause speaks of returning these fugitives to the party to whom such service or labor may be due. But he says there can't be anything due from a slave to his alleged master, right? The word due implies we have some kind of contract. You do something for me, I'm going to do something for you. Of course, the enslaved people in the South had made no such contract, right? They never agreed to any such thing. Moreover, the clause describes these fugitives as being held to service or labor. Well, there were many enslaved people who were too young or too old or too infirm to work. So they weren't held to service or labor. They were held against their will, but they're not held to service or labor. Whereas he says, look, there are other groups who had agreed to contracts. They do have service or labor that's due. And they were by definition held to service or labor, namely, again, indentured servants and apprentices who agreed to work for a set number of years in return for some, whether it's money or passage to America or training in a profession or whatever it might be. And these are, as he points out, these are very big groups in revolutionary America. And so he says that, look, it seems entirely natural. It fits the language of the precise language of the text much better to say that this fugitives from labor clause applies not to enslaved people, but rather to apprentices and indentured servants. So there's a lot more that you could say about all three of these clauses. I do say a lot more about them in the book. This is, frankly, one of the hardest things to do in a lecture format like this, is to do super close textual, analysis. But the basic point is, again, by the 1850s, Douglass found a way to just neatly dispose of each of these allegedly pro-slavery clauses to his own satisfaction. And again, the broader point is, look, what's the point of the Constitution? The stated aims of the framers are hostile to slavery. If we just extend the Constitution's protections to all Americans, slavery itself has to be abolished immediately, even in the South. Right? So properly read, the Constitution is just an outright abolitionist charter. Okay, so let me conclude by returning to where I started with what I call the 1619 view and the 1776 view of the founding. So what I want to suggest is that Douglass's mature view that I've been going over for the last 20 or 25 minutes, that his mature view of the founding and founders constitutes an alternative to both the 1619 view and the 1776 view, and I think avoids the major pitfalls of both. And how? What I've tried to show, Douglass's view wasn't just, well, it's somewhere between a mean between these two extremes, right? That the founding is noble in some respects and is flawed in other respects. This kind of middle of the road position. This is frankly the view of most historians today. I think there's a great deal of sense in it. In my experience, this is where students kind of naturally gravitate toward, when they start to grapple with the founding in a serious way for the first time. But again, that's not Douglass's position, that it's just somewhere between those extremes. Rather, the mature Douglass admired the founding, admired the founders, every bit as enthusiastically as even the most firm adherents of the 1776 view today. In fact, he went further than almost anyone today would dare to go, including myself, I have to say, further than anyone today would dare to go in characterizing the founders and the nation's founding documents as resolutely anti-slavery. So, he avoids the worry, unlike the most extreme adherents of the 1619 view, he absolutely doesn't just fatalistically write off America and is intrinsically, irredeemably racist. Right? On the other hand, his very firm embrace of the founding didn't engender even the slightest bit of the complacency and just unreflective patriotism and blindness to oppression that often do seem to accompany the 1776 view today. On the contrary, he remained second to none in denouncing America for the evils that it perpetrated and enabled both before and after the Civil War. So Douglass managed to combine these two things that rarely go together today, right? On the one hand, deep admiration for the nation's birth. On the other hand, radical criticism of the nation itself, right? He managed to combine these things, well, in part by emphasizing just how far America's practice had deviated from its first principles, right? The Declaration, the Constitution had promised liberty and equal rights for all, and yet in his time, a really big fraction of the American population can endure the most brutal tyranny imaginable. But also, and I think in some ways more interestingly, Douglass regarded the founders themselves as radicals, right? So to oversimplify only slightly, the founders fought tyranny in their time, taking the word fight in the most literal possible sense. They literally fought tyranny in their time, and he thought we should emulate them by fighting it in ours. And that's why, maybe a bit counterintuitively, but after he began to embrace the founding, he grew more open to the use of violence to combat slaveholders, and especially slave catchers. And he thought this was, true fidelity to the Constitution and to the founders' vision required not just docile obedience, but militant resistance to tyranny in any form. There's a real sense in which Douglass saw himself and his fellow abolitionists, the radicals of his day, as following directly in the founders' footsteps, right? Both slavery and Britain's governance over the colonies involved an assertion of arbitrary power, a violation of people's rights, governing, imposing rule on them without their consent. And so Douglass's argument was, look, if the founders were heroic because they bravely stood up against this kind of tyranny in their time, a 3-penny tax on tea, as he sometimes called it, and most of his contemporaries did believe that they were noble and brave for standing up to that, well then surely the abolitionists like himself, who stood up against a much worse form of tyranny, in the form of chattel slavery, well, so too were they heroic. And so that's why he thought that Douglass and his fellow radicals, not moderates like Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans, it was radicals like Douglass who were the founders' true heirs. So I'm going to stop there. I'm finished there. Thank you for bearing with me all the way through.